In 1949, the funeral home that we had, that facility was more than adequate for what we were doing to provide service to families. Number one, almost everyone died at home. You rarely had a death at the hospital or at any kind of other facility. And then people would come to the funeral home to tell you about a death. Or if they knew someone that had a phone, they would call that person to call the funeral home or come and tell us about the death. And then we would go to the person's home to pick them up there at the time of death. Typically, the doctor would have been contacted by the family, and oftentimes they just knew that. They didn't contact medical people until we did it. That was just the way things were handled then. And then the family would come to the funeral home for one purpose. We would pick up the body. Embalming was performed at the funeral home. And then the family would come there to choose a casket to use. And that's all the space that we needed, because families' home centered the funeral. The receiving of friends, often called the wake, and a traditional term that I heard used just 2 or 3 weeks ago up at the Thomas Wolfe House in Asheville. It was called the layout. You laid out the dead in the parlor of the person's home. And up until the 70s, after I came back to Morganton after schooling, I can still remember taking calls and people asking, when is the layout? And they were, of course, by then referring to receiving of friends, but we knew, of course, what they meant. So once the family made the selection of a casket and the funeral arrangements made with us, and we made all the announcements and whatnot, everything was done by phone. I can remember sitting at the desk at the funeral home and reading the obituary to the news outlets. There were no faxes, no emails. You just had to do it. You were lucky to do it by phone, because prior to that you had to write it up, handwritten typically, and deliver it in person to the news outlets. So the telephone was a step up. And of course, we had a telephone upstairs at the funeral home. That was also our personal line, so we had to be very careful about, and we had a private line, it wasn't a party line, so we had to be careful about phone usage and talking to our friends, because the people had to be able to call into the funeral home, and Mother and Daddy were very strict about that. And we learned phone etiquette very early. I loved when you'd pick up the phone and the operator would say, "Number, please." And I would tell them what number, and the operator said, "Okay, Calvin, let me connect you." It was